In today's episode, I build some retaining walls, finish up the foliage, and create a tunnel scene. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, That Model Railway Guy, for episode 8 of my TT120 layout build. Today's episode has very kindly been sponsored by D-Rails, a fantastic model shop, and I'll be telling you why that is a little bit later on. Now, it's fair to say that this is probably one of my most complex layouts to date, featuring multiple tunnels, bridges, and even an upper level. All of these have to be properly bedded into the landscape to make them look like they're supposed to be there and not like they've just been placed. So in today's episode, I'm going to work on the tunnel, the bridge, and even an epic 11-arch retaining wall, which I think is going to look pretty spectacular. All this is really going to change the look of the layout, but before I dive in, there is one little area I want to add some finishing touches to. Last time out, you'll remember I made a lot of progress on the countryside part of the layout, adding in this large field with a road round the side. While this whole area is looking fairly complete, I do want to add some additional foliage to this side of the layout for some extra detail. I'll start out by putting down blobs of PVA glue at random where I think some foliage would look good. In some cases though, the PVA can be put in strategic places to hide areas that don't look quite right. I then add some woodland scenics clump foliage to the PVA to create some bushes and shrubs alongside the railway. As always, I want to use a mix of colours to keep things looking natural, so here I'm using a combination of both light green and medium green foliage. There's links to both of these in the description, which goes for everything else shown in today's video too. And gradually I'm just adding this all over the bank and the grassy areas around the track. One place in particular where additional foliage can make a big difference is on the rock face. Adding a little bit of this in between the individual rocks not only fills in the gaps really nicely, but it also makes the rock formation look more natural and bedded into the landscape. Having worked my way around the entire section, this part of the layout is now looking much better. I do think additional foliage like this can make a huge difference, and it stops the grassy areas looking too neat or uniform. Generally, I've stuck to the rougher ground where people wouldn't be going out to cut back the undergrowth. Meanwhile, I've left the field mostly untouched, aside from the wall at the back alongside the path. And similarly, I've added some foliage alongside the road too, as I really like the way this helps blend the dirt verge and the walling together. With that done, it's now time to move on to the main part of today's video. The upper level is in place and all operational, but it does need to be integrated into the layout more. At the moment it looks a little bit like it's up on stilts, but my plan here is to create a retaining wall using some brick arches. Now this is a single section of the retaining wall which I designed myself and made using the laser cutter. It was then painted up using a mixture of browns and oranges for the general brick colour, before filler was used to bring out the tiny brickwork. I think it looks absolutely great, and I've designed them in such a way that you can slot several of these together really easily. For example, here's 3 of the walls which I've joined together to add to the front of the upper level. You can see the middle one actually features a slightly alternate version with a door built into it, and the reasoning for that will hopefully become apparent later on in the series. Of course, these 3 retaining walls aren't enough to cover the entire front of the upper level, but next to this is also where the reverse loop cuts through the middle of the layout. Luckily, the way I designed these retaining walls means that if you remove the main back piece, you can also use it as a single track tunnel portal. I really can't wait to see trains blasting out of this tunnel mouth, and again next to this we have a couple of other arches which have both been converted into industrial units. Finally, we have another 5 retaining wall sections which will stretch all the way down to the other end of the layout. That makes up 11 arches in total, and with all these in place it looks really quite impressive, especially with the train standing in the station above. I'm not actually going to fix these in place, as I'd still like to be able to get access to the wiring behind this in case of an emergency. And also, if anything derails in the tunnels too, it means I've got a way of getting inside to retrieve anything that gets stuck. But overall, I think these look fantastic, and it's great to see these arches stretching along this entire side of the layout. Now, as with the cottage I showed in the last episode, I am going to make these kits available to buy in my shop, and there should be a link to them in the description right now. They're super easy kits to put together, and I think they'll be really great for anyone else out there building an urban section on a TT120 layout. As I mentioned at the start of this video, today's episode has very kindly been sponsored by Derails, who are one of my favourite model shops to buy from, and also long-time supporters of the channel too. Derails really feel like a model shop who try to look after their customers. For example, they've just started up a new offer on Pico points, where you get more of a discount the more points you order. This is obviously really handy if you're laying the track for your model railway and you need to buy a lot of points all in one go. For example, if you're laying a station or a fiddle yard. The points can often be the most expensive part of a layout, and it's great to see Derails trying something out like this. Now currently they're just trialling this, so if you want to take advantage of it, I'd get in there sooner rather than later. But like some of their other incentives they've run in the past, if this is successful, then it could become a long-term thing, which would be fantastic. I put a link to this offer down in the description so you can find out more information about it. Or you can check out derails.co.uk just if you want to see what they have in stock right now. I highly recommend them, and yeah, thank you so much to Derails for sponsoring this video. While the retaining walls will be removable, something that will be fixed in place is the tunnel mouth, where the main line dives under the upper level. This is another laser cut piece I've designed using the same brick theme as the retaining walls, but this time for a double track tunnel portal. Now, I don't want this whole video to be a sales pitch, but again, this is going to be available as a kit in my shop, and it also comes with 2 wing walls as well, although I'm only going to be using one on this build today. With the tunnel in position though, if you look through, you can just see some of the supports, and from the other angle, the wiring that controls the upper level. While I can't hide this entirely, I would like to make it less obvious, so I've made up some panels with the brick pattern on which will act as interior walls. As these won't be fully on display, I've just painted them a dark brown, with the filler being used to bring out the brickwork again. The darker colour will help give the impression that these stretch through the entire tunnel, and I imagine brick would be a lot more dirty inside the tunnel anyway. With the inserts glued into place on either side of the track, the main tunnel portal can be glued into place with a bit of PVA on the bottom and also the back where it touches the plywood surface of the upper level. The wing wall is also glued in position beside this too, and I'll set it at a slight angle just to open up the view of the tunnel. I do also want to build up the landscape around the tunnel too, in order to really blend it into the scene. As in previous episodes, I have plenty of packing foam sheets which I've cut to a very rough shape. There's then a longer strip which curves around the front of the layout to create a more gradual descent. This isn't high enough to block the view of the trains as they enter and exit the tunnel, but it is enough to stop the landscape looking too flat and makes this area a little more interesting. I'll also add a couple of smaller bits of foam to the very top as well, and this will just blend in the join to the upper level. At this point I was going to start adding the mod rock, but I actually decided to remove the wing wall first, as I felt it would be easier to do without this in place. Luckily the PVA glue hadn't dried yet, and the excess was able to be wiped away. Plaster bandage was then added all over the foam to create a consistent surface to work on. As this is a relatively small area, it didn't take long to do this step, and it was a lot easier not having to blend this into the wing wall. Instead, once the mod rock was dry, I simply glued the wing back in place and it all matches up really nicely. The mod rock was then painted brown to disguise the white plaster and act as an absolute base level for the scenics. I always get people asking what paint I use for this, and it's literally just cheap acrylic poster paint, so nothing fancy. Generally I mix a little bit of black into the brown to darken down the colour, but that's not a necessity, it's just my personal preference. With the paint down though, I can now move on to the scenics for this area. On the countryside section of the layout, I added a dirt verge alongside the track, so I'll continue that theme here too. I start out by putting down a base of PVA glue beside the ballast, and this will mark out where the verge will go. Additionally, because the railway doesn't run completely straight along the front, this verge actually stretches quite a bit further down the layout. The universal ground cover from Specialist Aggregates is then dropped into the glue to create the verge itself. For the main scenics, I'll use the same combination of scatters and colours that I've used elsewhere on the layout to help tie it all together. With the base layer of PVA glue down, the earth-coloured blended turf from Woodland Scenics is then added over the area. And as I'm working on the edge of this layout, you can see I've got the box I keep this scatter in underneath just to catch any that spills over the edge. This scatter is a nice muted colour. It's not quite brown, but it's far from green, and so it acts as a really nice base to tone everything down as I add the more vibrant colours over the top. Speaking of vibrant colours, green fine turf is then added straight over this. I'm partly adding it with the sieve for coverage of finer particles, but also with my fingers too, which clumps the flock together for a slightly more rough appearance. As in the previous episodes, I don't want this to be a complete covering, and by allowing the blended turf underneath to show through in patches, it creates a more natural, organic look to the colouring. This fine turf is also used directly over the dirt verge that runs down the layout for a more patchy, weed-like appearance beside the line. The final step is to then add a small sprinkling of the yellow grass fine turf. This just adds in another texture to the landscape and creates some nice highlights. With all the scenics in place, it's time to seal everything with spray glue to hold it down. However, don't make the mistake I did here and start too close to the scenics, as you'll see the spray itself actually moves the foliage out of place. A rookie error on my part there, but after readjusting the scatter, the proper way to start out is by spraying the glue from higher up and letting it fall onto the area you want the glue. Once the flock and scatter is a little damp, the weight of the moisture will hold it in place as you continue spraying. Then you can get much closer to really soak everything in glue. Now, I've had a few people say they're worried about getting glue on the track, especially when I'm working so close to it like this, but it's not really a big deal. You can always wipe the excess away from the top of the rails while it's still wet. Then when it's dry, I tend to run a track rubber over it just to remove the film of PVA. For the verge around the tunnel and further along the curve, I'm opting to put down the glue using a syringe. This allows for a slightly more concentrated approach and works well for holding the top surface of the dirt scatter in place. You can see I'm only really adding very small drops at a time as the glue spreads out nicely on its own. The trickiest bit to do was actually inside the tunnel, as I couldn't really see what I was doing. Here I was actually using the camera monitor as a set of eyes, as it had a much better view than me. With a bit of manoeuvring though, I managed to get some of the glue on the scatter inside the tunnel. And those of you paying attention may have noticed that there's a bit of a gap between the final arch of the retaining wall and the tunnel. To remedy this, I've just cut another section of brick walling to fill the gap. It needs some slight sanding just to allow it to fit under the capping, but you can see what the intention is here. With the glue dry on my scenics though, you can see the final result is really nice, and I think it creates a great little scene around the tunnel. As this side of the layout will be more industrial with lots of buildings around the station and goods yard, it's nice to be able to introduce a little patch of green here just for a bit of variety. Obviously, I'm starting to make more progress on the layout now that the scenics are going down, and that means there's some fairly big changes coming in each episode. The next video in this series, for example, focuses on the station area, and if you want to watch that right now, you can become a channel member to get early access to new episodes. It's not just this series, of course, you get early access to all new videos on the channel and exclusive members only videos too. I've actually got some of those that I'm working on at the moment, so this is a really good time to sign up. You can do that by clicking the link in the description, or if you're on desktop there should be a join button below this video as well. Either of those takes you through to a screen where you can see all the different benefits on the different tiers before making a final decision. And yeah, hopefully I'll see some of you in the members area really soon. For now though, let's head right back to the layout. Having done the arches for the retaining walls followed by the double track tunnel, it's now time to turn my attention to the bridge on the layout. I already have the basic structure in place with track laid over the top, and now it's time to add the scenics to this area too. Now I've recently been trying my hand at 3D printing and I stumbled across this free design online. I've left a link to it in the description for anyone who wants to print it themselves, and by pure coincidence this was exactly the style and length of bridge I was looking for. I don't think it's scaled for TT120, but it's literally the same length I need, and I wanted an open frame style of bridge like this so that you could see the trains passing over it. I did have a little bit of an issue with the print at this end though, and while I could just print another one, it did take quite a long time to print given how large this is. And I actually have a plan on how to incorporate this into the layout, which I think will make for a nice feature. Of course, at the moment these bridge sections are just in the grey resin colour, so they need to be painted. First I'll quickly pop outside and put some spray primer on them. Okay, and with that done, now let's really transform these. The grey primer is a good base, but I actually want this to be a darker, more muted grey, so I've mixed up some cheap acrylics to paint this on. And I'm giving this a fairly rough coat as I don't want it to look too consistent, so where it's thinner the lighter grey of the primer will show through. Like I said earlier, the left hand side of the layout will be less countryside and more of a built up industrial area, and this bridge really is the transition point from one to the other. So I want to give these bridge sides a really heavily weathered look, and I'll start that by adding on some brown. This is actually the rail match sleeper grind that I used on the track, and I just really like the colour and the matte finish this paint has. I'm also dry brushing this on, which means rather than just painting it straight on, I'm wiping away most of the paint on some tissue until there's only a tiny amount left on the brush. Then with the brush mostly dry, I run it over the bridge and small flecks of paint randomly catch on the surface and the detailing. The result is a really quick way to add some random patches of dirt and grime without it looking too consistent. And in isolation, it doesn't actually look like it's made that much of a difference, but when we compare it to the other section, you can see it's a subtle but worthwhile effect. I really want to go all out with this though and make it look like a bridge that is really coming towards the end of its life, so I'll do some more dry brushing, this time with the Rail Match Light Rust paint. This orangey colour can be used sparingly in select areas to create a more rusty effect, and it works particularly well around the rivet detail. And again, you can see a comparison here between the version with the rust and without. These painted sections will sit on top of the existing bridge deck, and it should just be a case of gluing these in place. However, before I get to that, I want to add a little scenic touch to the lead up to the bridge, which at the moment is just painted polystyrene. I've made another brick sheet like I did for the tunnel mouths, but this one is made from 0.4mm laser board, so it's nice and thin. Painted up though, it looks exactly the same as the other brick on the layout, and so I'm going to glue this to the front of the incline just before the bridge. This can be done just by adding some PVA to the surface. The brick sheet is then slid in from underneath the bridge. I'm doing it this way as the top edge is slightly lower on the right hand side to account for the angle of the incline, so getting it in this way was a lot easier. And obviously this doesn't stretch the whole way down to the rock face, but I have a plan for the rest of this which will feature in an upcoming episode. For the sake of completion, I've also added another shorter section of brick round the corner too, so together these will look like the support for the bridge. The bridge sides can then be glued in place, starting with the one at the back first. As these 3D prints don't have any detail on the rear sides, I'm going to have both of them face out front since this is the angle the layout will be viewed from anyway. The side piece for the front is then also glued in place too. And with that, I'm done for the day, so let's get some trains running. I have to say I'm really pleased with what I've achieved in this episode. Although the work has been spread out across the whole layout, it's really made a big difference, from the huge stretch of arches down the left hand side of the layout to the tunnel and now the bridge scene as well. Each of these has made a really big impact on the layout, and don't forget, if you want to get hold of the retaining wall kits or the tunnel mouths for your own TT layout, they're available to pre-order in my shop right now. I also have to say a big thank you to everyone who has placed an order for the stone cottage too. Hopefully we'll be shipping those out really soon, if in fact we haven't already by the time this video is released. Like I said though, that's it for today's video, so thank you so much for watching everyone. Don't forget, if you're a channel member, you can watch the next episode in the series right now, and here's a look at what you can expect. I build a hill, add a new scenic feature, and start work on the station.